A billionaire discovers his housekeeper's daughter scrubbing dishes at 2 a.m., and what he's about to uncover will shatter everything he thought he understood about sacrifice. At 2 a.m., the pristine silence of James Lawson's mansion is pierced by the rhythmic scrape of a sponge against porcelain. When the insomniac billionaire enters his expansive kitchen, he finds Danielle Penn, the 17-year-old daughter of his housekeeper, hunched over a towering pile of dinner plates, her hands raw and red, her young face frozen in quiet panic. She should be studying for exams. She should be dreaming about college. She should not be here. James built a global empire by seeing patterns others missed, by predicting problems before they fully formed. And the desperation flickering across Danielle's exhausted face tells him this is more than a teenager helping her mother. It's the beginning of a tragedy she is desperately trying to hide. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2 a.m., its hollow chime resonating through the empty corridors of James Lawson's sprawling estate. He stood motionless in his study, expensive suit still perfectly pressed despite the hour, financial reports scattered across his mahogany desk untouched. Insomnia was the one equation his brilliant mind refused to solve. The mansion was silent, until it wasn't. A faint, rhythmic sound drifted from somewhere below. Not the usual hum of automation. Not the wind against the windows. Something human. Something wrong. James followed the sound down the marble staircase and through the darkened hallway, where he stepped into the gleaming industrial kitchen and found Danielle Penn working like someone running from something she couldn't name. Her shoulders were hunched with exhaustion. Her eyes darted away from his the moment she sensed his presence. And in that suspended moment, James Lawson, the man who built fortunes by reading markets and predicting collapse, realized a different kind of crisis was unfolding right in front of him. A crisis wearing a Medical Honors Society pin on a worn backpack. A crisis with the hands of a child doing the desperate work of survival. And somewhere in the back of his brilliant, sleepless mind, a pattern began to form. One that would lead him back 50 years to a debt he never knew existed. James didn't ask questions. Questions implied negotiation, and this wasn't a negotiation. "Go home," he said, his voice low and absolute. Not loud. Not angry. Just final. The same tone he used to end boardroom debates worth billions. "Now!" Danielle opened her mouth to protest, her young face a mixture of fear and desperation, but something in his expression stopped her cold. She set down the sponge with trembling fingers, grabbed her backpack, and fled. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, leaving only the faint scent of dish soap and the echo of her hurried footsteps. James stood alone in the vast, gleaming kitchen, staring at the mountain of half-washed plates. His mind, the same mind that had built empires by connecting invisible dots, was already working, assembling fragments into something he couldn't yet see clearly. The Medical Honors Society pin. The raw hands. The terror in her eyes that went deeper than being caught breaking rules. This wasn't about dishes. He glanced at the antique clock above the stove. 2:47 a.m. Too late to make calls. Too early to sleep. Not that sleep would come anyway. James walked back to his study, poured himself 2 fingers of scotch he wouldn't drink, and waited for dawn like a predator watching for movement in the dark. At precisely 7 a.m., he dialed George Mitchell, his head of staff for 15 years. A former military intelligence analyst who knew how to find answers to questions that hadn't been asked yet. George answered on the first ring. "Mr. Lawson." "I need information," James said without preamble. "Mrs. Penn, my housekeeper. I need her complete medical history, current health status, and insurance coverage details. Today." A pause. Professional, not judgmental. "Of course. Anything specific I should." "Everything. And her daughter, Danielle. I want her school records. Attendance, grades, scholarships, disciplinary actions. Everything from the last 6 months." James heard the subtle shift in George's breathing, the recognition that this wasn't routine. "Understood. Is there a concern I should?" "One more thing." James's gaze fell on the photograph he'd noticed on Danielle's backpack, the one that had been partially visible when she'd set it down. A young Marine in dress blues, proud and straight-backed. There's a photo of a veteran on the girl's backpack. Military dress uniform, looks like Marines, probably from the 70s or 80s. "I need to know who he is. Service record, deployment history, any connection to this family." Now the pause was longer. George had worked for James long enough to know when his employer was hunting something. "How quickly do you need this?" James set down his untouched scotch and stared out at the manicured grounds of his estate, at the world his wealth had built. A world that suddenly felt smaller and less important than a 17-year-old girl with broken hands and a secret she was dying to protect. "I needed it yesterday," he said quietly. "But noon will have to do." He ended the call and finally allowed himself to close his eyes, though rest wouldn't come. Somewhere in the growing daylight, pieces were moving into place. A pattern was forming. And James Lawson had never walked away from a pattern unfinished. George called back at 11:43 a.m., 17 minutes ahead of deadline. "You were right to ask," George said without pleasantries, his voice carrying the weight of bad news delivered too many times in his intelligence career. Danielle Penn, 17 years old. Valedictorian track at Martin Luther King High School. Perfect GPA. Science fair winner 3 years running. She was accepted to Howard University on a full academic scholarship, the Founders Merit Award. Pre-med track. James felt something cold settle in his chest. The scholarship was contingent on maintaining attendance and grades through senior year. She's been absent for 28 consecutive school days. The university sent a final warning letter 3 weeks ago. As of last Friday, the scholarship was revoked. James stood and walked to his office window, watching the groundskeeper trim hedges that didn't need trimming. "Why?" "Mrs. Penn." George's tone shifted, became quieter. "Clara Penn, age 42. Diagnosed with severe sickle cell disease 15 years ago. She's been managing it with standard treatment, but 6 weeks ago she had a major crisis, vaso-occlusive episode that put her in the ER for 3 days. The attending physician prescribed Adakveo, a newer medication that prevents these crises. It's highly effective. Also highly expensive." "How expensive?" $1,200 per month. Their insurance, basic coverage through your household staff plan, classifies it as not medically necessary because cheaper alternatives exist, even though those alternatives aren't working for her specific case. The appeal was denied. James closed his eyes. $1,200. He spent more than that on wine he never drank. And Danielle? She's been covering her mother's cleaning shifts here and at 2 other homes. Unpaid. Clara's clients think Clara is still doing the work. School administration has called 17 times. Danielle blocked the principal's number. George paused, and James heard papers rustling. And she's working nights at the Big Fry on Westwood Avenue. Minimum wage, cash under the table because she's not 18. 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., 6 nights a week. The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. The exhaustion. The raw hands. The terror when he'd found her. A 17-year-old girl, working 2 shifts plus school hours, sacrificing a full scholarship to a prestigious university, throwing away her entire future. All to scrape together $1,200 a month to keep her mother alive. "That's not sustainable," James said quietly. "No, sir, it's not. At this rate, she won't graduate. And even if she somehow does, the scholarship is gone. She's losing everything to buy her mother 30 more days at a time." James stood silent, watching the manicured perfection of his grounds, thinking about a girl scrubbing dishes at 2 a.m. in a stranger's mansion, thinking about the Medical Honors Society pin on a backpack that would never make it to college, thinking about the devastating mathematics of poverty, where $1,200 was the difference between a future and nothing at all. "And the veteran?" he asked. George's voice changed again, became careful. "That's where it gets interesting, sir. Sergeant Major David Penn, United States Marine Corps. Retired 1979. He was Danielle's grandfather, Clara's father. Died 8 years ago." Another pause. "He served in the same unit as your father. Vietnam, 1973. There's a photograph in the archived battalion records. I'm sending it now." James's phone buzzed. He opened the image and felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. 2 young Marines, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera despite the jungle and the war behind them. One was unmistakably his father, young, alive, decades before the heart attack that would take him. The other was David Penn. "Find out everything about their service together," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything. Already on it, sir." James ended the call and stared at the photograph, at 2 men who had survived something together, at a connection that had somehow led to a 17-year-old girl destroying her life 1 dish at a time. The pattern was complete now, and it was worse than he'd imagined. George's second call came at 4:17 p.m., and his voice carried a gravity James had rarely heard from the former intelligence officer. "Sergeant Major David Penn," George began. 22 years in the Marine Corps. 3 tours in Vietnam. Decorated twice for valor under fire. He and your father served together in the same rifle company, Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. They were stationed at Firebase Ripcord in April 1973, during the final American operations. James had already pulled his father's old footlocker from storage, the one that had sat untouched in the estate's archive room since his father's death 12 years ago. His hands were steady as he lifted the tarnished lock, but something in his chest was not. There was an incident, George continued. April 23, 1973. Their firebase came under coordinated assault. Mortar fire, small arms. Your father's position was overrun. Penn pulled him out of a collapsing bunker under direct fire, carried him 200 meters to the evacuation point. Your father took shrapnel to the leg and shoulder. Without Penn, he would have died there. James's fingers found what they were looking for beneath faded uniform pieces and tarnished metals. A bundle of letters, tied with string that had turned brown with age. He knew his father's handwriting instantly. But there were others, too. Letters his father had kept. Letters he'd never mentioned. He unfolded one carefully, and the words, written in precise, formal script on yellowed paper, seemed to echo across 50 years. Lieutenant Lawson, you don't owe me anything for Ripcord. We look after our own. That's the deal. But if something happens to me, if I don't make it back, I need you to know my family is taken care of. My wife, my daughter Clara. That's all I ask. We're Marines. We finish what we start. Semper Fi, Sergeant Major David Penn. James read it twice, then a third time. His father had kept this letter for 40 years. Had carried it home from the war. Had preserved it like something sacred. Your father tried to stay in touch with Penn after the war, George said quietly. I found correspondence through 1985. Then it stops. I think that's when your father's business obligations became consuming. James knew what George was too polite to say. His father had gotten busy. Had gotten rich. Had forgotten. And now, 50 years later, David Penn's granddaughter was working herself to death in James's kitchen, destroying her future to save her mother, while James slept, or failed to sleep, in a mansion built on an empire his father had only survived to create because a Marine named Penn had refused to leave him behind. Clara Penn is David Penn's daughter, James said, though it wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Only child. Danielle is his only grandchild. James looked at the photograph again. His father and Penn, young and alive and bound by something that transcended wealth or status or time. Brothers in the way that only war created brothers. This isn't an employee's child, James said softly, his voice low and dangerous with purpose. This is family. This is a debt 50 years overdue. He stood, the letter still in his hand, and felt something shift inside him. Something cold and calculating giving way to something older. Something that had nothing to do with markets or empires or the billions he'd accumulated. George, I need Mrs. Penn's address. And I need you to clear my schedule for the next 3 days. Already done, sir. James carefully folded the letter and placed it in his jacket pocket, right over his heart. David Penn had saved his father's life, had asked only that his family be protected, and James's father had forgotten. Had let time and success and the relentless march of building an empire erase the debt that mattered most. But James Lawson had built his fortune by seeing patterns, by solving problems everyone else overlooked. And he had just found the one problem that mattered more than all the others combined. The debt was due, and he intended to pay it in full. The apartment building stood in stark contrast to the manicured world James had left behind. Cracked brick, rusted fire escapes, a door that didn't quite close properly. Unit 3B. He climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking under his weight, and knocked. Clara Penn opened the door looking like a woman who'd been caught at something she could never explain. Her face, so much like her father's in that photograph, went pale when she saw him standing there in his tailored suit, so impossibly out of place in this dim hallway that smelled of old cooking and worn carpet. Mr. Lawson. Her voice cracked. I didn't know you were coming. Danielle, she shouldn't have. May I come in? She stepped aside wordlessly, shame radiating from her like heat. The apartment was small and painfully clean, the kind of clean that came from pride being the only thing left to hold on to. A worn couch, a kitchen table with mismatched chairs, photographs on the wall showing happier times, including one of Sergeant Major Penn in his dress blues, the same photograph James had seen on Danielle's backpack. Clara wouldn't meet his eyes. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, a woman bracing for the blow she knew was coming. "How long have you been sick?" James asked quietly. "I tried to hide it." The words tumbled out like a confession. "I thought I could manage it. I thought if I just worked harder, took the cheaper medication, I could." Her voice broke. "I never wanted this to touch her. Never wanted her to know. But she found out." Clara's face crumpled. She sank onto the couch and put her head in her hands. She found the letter. The acceptance letter from Howard University. I'd thrown it away because I couldn't let her go. Not when I needed the medication, not when I couldn't work enough hours to pay for it. James sat in the chair across from her, his voice gentle. "What did she say?" "She pulled it out of the trash." Clara's shoulders shook with silent sobs. She looked at me with those big eyes, so confused, and she asked, "What's a scholarship, Mom? Does it pay for your medicine?" The sound that came from Clara's throat was part laugh, part break. "She thought it was something you got paid for. She thought she could use it to help me." James felt something crack inside his chest. I told her no, that it was for her future, for college. And she just smiled at me and said, "Then I don't need it right now. You need medicine now." Clara looked up at him finally, her face wet with tears. "She's 17 years old, Mr. Lawson. She should be worrying about prom and graduation, not choosing between her mother's life and her own future." "Where is she now?" Clara wiped her face with shaking hands. "Working. She works nights at the Big Fry downtown. 10 to 2, 6 days a week. She comes home smelling like grease and exhaustion, does my work during the day, then goes back out again." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I told her to stop. I begged her. But she won't listen. She just keeps saying, 'It's only for a little while, Mom. Until you're better.'" James stood slowly, his jaw set with that same dangerous purpose Clara's father must have had when he ran into fire to save a brother. "The Big Fry on Westwood?" "Yes, but Mr. Lawson, please don't. She'll be so humiliated if you—" "Mrs. Penn," James said quietly, turning to face her. "Your father saved my father's life 50 years ago. This conversation is far from over, but right now, I need to go get your daughter." He left Clara sitting in her small, clean apartment, surrounded by photographs of a Marine who had kept his promises. And James Lawson intended to keep his. The Big Fry was everything James expected and worse. A fluorescent-lit cave that smelled of old grease and desperation, where the floors stuck to your shoes and the air hung heavy with the sound of fryers and shouted orders. The kind of place that existed in every city, feeding people too tired or too broke to care what they were eating. James stood just inside the door, invisible in his expensive suit among the late-night crowd of truckers and third-shift workers. His eyes found her immediately. Danielle Penn was barely recognizable under the grease-stained cap and oversized uniform shirt. She moved like an automaton, taking orders, filling drinks, wiping tables. Her young face blank with the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than just missing sleep. She was 17 years old, and she moved like someone who'd forgotten what it meant to be young. He watched her for 10 minutes, cataloging every detail the way he'd learned to catalog market trends and business risks. The way she flinched when the kitchen bell rang too loudly. The way her hands shook slightly when she carried overloaded trays. The way she smiled at customers with a brightness that never reached her eyes. This was what $1,200 a month looked like. This was the price of a mother's life, paid in a daughter's future. James stepped forward into the harsh light. Danielle. Her name, spoken in his voice, cut through the diner noise like a blade. She froze mid-step, a tray loaded with 5 large sodas balanced precariously in her hands. Her head whipped toward him, her eyes going wide with the same terror he'd seen in his kitchen. That look of someone whose secret had just been exposed in the worst possible way. The tray tilted. Time seemed to slow. 5 sodas, 32 ounces each, gravity and momentum and terrible timing. They hit the floor in a cascading crash of ice and liquid and plastic cups, spreading across the sticky linoleum in a dark, fizzing puddle. Jesus Christ, Penn, the manager, a thick-necked man whose name tag read Mitch, appeared from behind the counter like something summoned by disaster. "That's the 3rd time this week. That's coming straight out of your pay, you hear me? Straight out." Danielle stood frozen in the spreading puddle, her face flushed with shame, her hands still holding the empty tray like a shield that had failed to protect her. James moved. He crossed the space between them in 4 strides and placed himself directly between the manager and the girl. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made boardrooms go silent, that made grown men reconsider their positions. No, it's not. Mitch blinked, his anger momentarily short-circuited by the appearance of a man in a $5,000 suit standing in his diner at midnight. Who the hell are? The drinks, the cleanup, and whatever inconvenience this has caused you. James reached into his wallet and placed $300 bills on the nearest table with the precise, deliberate movements of someone who was barely containing something much more dangerous than anger. That should more than cover it. The manager stared at the money, his mouth working soundlessly. Her shift is over, James continued, his tone leaving no room for debate. Effective immediately. She won't be returning. Now wait I wasn't asking. James's voice dropped another octave, carrying the weight of every difficult decision he'd ever made, every empire-building negotiation where he'd refused to lose. We're done here. He turned to Danielle, who was still standing in the puddle of spilled drinks, her face a mixture of shock and mortification, and something that looked almost like relief. She was shaking, from exhaustion, from embarrassment, from the sudden collapse of the precarious system she'd built to keep her mother alive. James extended his hand. Clean. Steady. A lifeline offered across the wreckage. Come on, he said gently, and the gentleness in his voice after the steel he'd shown the manager seemed to break something in her. Danielle looked at his hand, at the clean, uncalloused fingers that had never worked a fryer or scrubbed dishes until they bled, and then at her own small, grease-stained hand. For a moment, James thought she might refuse, might retreat back into the desperate pride that had brought her here. Then she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold and sticky and trembling, and James closed his hand around hers like he was sealing a promise that was 50 years overdue. He pulled her gently to her feet, guided her around the spilled drinks, and walked her toward the door. Behind them, Mitch shouted something about uniforms and final paychecks, but James didn't turn around. He kept walking, keeping Danielle steady as she stumbled slightly on exhausted legs and pushed through the glass door into the cool night air. The Big Fry's fluorescent sign buzzed and flickered above them. Danielle was crying silently now, the kind of crying that came from breaking under too much weight for too long. I need that job, she whispered. I need the money. My mom, your mother, James said quietly, would never forgive me if I let you go back in there. He guided her toward his car, and for the first time in 50 years, a debt began to shift from owed to paid. James pulled the car over 3 blocks from the Big Fry, into the empty parking lot of a closed grocery store. Danielle sat in the passenger seat, still shaking, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she could hold herself together through sheer force of will. Let me see your hand, James said quietly. She looked at him, confused. Your right hand. You cut it on the glass. She hadn't even noticed. A thin line of blood traced across her palm where a shard from one of the cups had sliced her. She stared at it like she was surprised her body could still bleed, like pain had become so ordinary she'd stopped registering it. James reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a first aid kit. The expensive kind, the kind that anticipated problems before they became emergencies. He opened it with practiced efficiency and took her hand gently in his. She flinched at the contact, but he held steady, cleaning the cut with an antiseptic wipe, his movements careful and deliberate. No one had taken care of her in so long. No one had noticed she was bleeding. That simple tenderness, the unexpected kindness of being seen, of being tended to, shattered whatever was left holding her together. I found her on the floor, Danielle whispered, and suddenly she couldn't stop. The words poured out like something that had been dammed up too long. 6 weeks ago. I came home from school, and Mom was on the floor in the kitchen. She couldn't move. She couldn't even cry, the pain was so bad. The ambulance came and they said it was a sickle cell crisis, that she needed this new medication, but it costs $1,200 every single month and our insurance won't cover it. James applied antibiotic ointment, then a small bandage, but he never looked away from her face. They discharged her and gave her a prescription, and I thought I could figure it out. I could work more, cover her shifts, get a night job. Just until she got better. Just until we could afford it. Her voice cracked. But it's every month, Mr. Lawson. It's not a one-time thing. It's $1,200 forever or she dies. So you sacrificed your scholarship. She threw away the acceptance letter. Danielle's tears came faster now. She threw it away because she knew she couldn't let me go. And when I found it, I realized college could wait. She couldn't wait. She was dying. The principal's calls? Danielle looked down at her newly bandaged hand. I blocked the number. Blocked the school counselor, too. They kept saying I was throwing away my future, but they didn't understand. What future? If my mom dies, what's the point of any of it? James closed the first aid kit with a soft click. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange mixture of sternness and something that sounded almost like affection. Your family, he said, are terrible liars. Your mother tried to hide her illness from you. You tried to hide your sacrifice from her. And both of you are so determined to protect each other that you're destroying each other instead. Danielle let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Your pride is costing you everything, her health, your education, your future. All for $1,200 a month. James turned to face her fully. Do you know what your grandfather would say if he could see this? She looked up at him, confused. My grandfather? Sergeant Major David Penn, United States Marine Corps. The man whose photograph you carry on your backpack. James's voice softened. The man who saved my father's life 50 years ago. Danielle's eyes went wide. I don't understand. I know, James said quietly. But you will. And so will your mother. Because this stops tonight, Danielle. All of it. The lying, the sacrifice, the slow destruction of two people who deserve so much better. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road, heading toward the apartment where Clara Penn waited, not knowing that the debt her father earned half a century ago was finally about to be paid in full. Clara Penn stood when they entered, her face cycling through relief, confusion, and renewed shame as she saw her daughter's tear-stained face and bandaged hand. Before she could speak, before either of them could retreat back into their careful lies and protective silences, James raised a hand. Sit down, he said, and it was not a request. Both of you. They sat, Clara on the worn couch, Danielle beside her. James remained standing, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same unyielding authority he'd used to end Danielle's shift at the Big Fry. This was not a discussion. This was a decision that had already been made. Mrs. Penn, tomorrow morning you have an appointment at Johns Hopkins Hospital with Dr. Patricia Chun, one of the country's leading hematologists specializing in sickle cell disease. She'll conduct a full evaluation and design a comprehensive treatment plan. You will receive Adakveo and any other medication Dr. Chun prescribes. All costs, medication, appointments, emergency care will be covered completely. This is not negotiable. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but James continued without pause. Danielle, my head of staff George will contact your school's administration first thing tomorrow morning. Your truancy will be explained as a family medical emergency, which it was. Your scholarship to Howard University will be reinstated. George will personally ensure that every administrative barrier is removed and that you graduate on schedule. You will attend prom. You will walk at graduation. You will go to college. This is also not negotiable. Mr. Lawson, we can't possibly, Clara started, her voice thick with tears and disbelief. Yes, you can. James pulled the yellowed letter from his jacket pocket and held it carefully, like the sacred thing it was. April 23rd, 1973. Firebase Ripcord, Vietnam. Your father, Sergeant Major David Penn, pulled my father out of a collapsing bunker under direct enemy fire. My father had taken shrapnel to his leg and shoulder. Without your father, he would have died there. Clara's hand went to her mouth. Danielle stared at the letter in James's hands. My father survived that day because your father refused to leave him behind. He came home, built a life, built a business, had a son. James's voice softened, but lost none of its intensity. Everything I have, every dollar, every asset, every breath I take, exists because your father ran into fire when anyone else would have run away. He set the letter gently on the table between them, next to a photograph of Sergeant Major Penn in his dress blues. Before he died, your father wrote my father a letter asking only one thing, that if something happened to him, his family would be taken care of. My father kept this letter for 40 years. He meant to honor it. But life got busy, success got consuming, and the debt went unpaid. James looked directly at Clara, then at Danielle, his expression absolutely resolute. I will not make my father's mistake. This is not charity. This is not pity. This is not some billionaire's whim. His voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous and utterly final. This is a debt 50 years overdue, and I am paying it. Tonight. In full. And neither of you gets to refuse it. The apartment was silent except for Clara's soft crying. Danielle sat frozen, staring at the photograph of the grandfather she'd been too young to really remember, the Marine whose image she'd carried without fully understanding why. Your father saved my family, James said quietly. Now let me save his. Clara Penn collapsed into her daughter's arms, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she cried not from despair but from the sudden, overwhelming relief of not having to be strong anymore. The debt was paid. The pattern was complete. And in the silence of that small apartment, something that had been broken for 50 years finally, irrevocably healed. 6 months later, James Lawson sat in the third row of Martin Luther King High School's auditorium, surrounded by proud parents and restless younger siblings, and watched Danielle Penn take the stage as valedictorian. She wore her cap and gown with a quiet confidence that hadn't existed that night at the Big Fry. Her hands, no longer raw, no longer shaking, held her speech with steady grace. In the audience, Clara Penn sat in the front row, her face glowing with health and pride, the sickle cell disease finally under control thanks to Dr. Chen's treatment plan. "We're taught that success is individual," Danielle began, her voice clear and strong. "That we earn what we achieve through our own merit, our own effort. But that's only half the story." She paused, her eyes finding James in the crowd. "The full truth is that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Those who sacrificed, who served, who refused to leave anyone behind even when it would have been easier to do so." James felt something tighten in his chest. "My grandfather, Sergeant Major David Penn, taught me something I didn't understand until recently. He taught me that true strength isn't just about what you survive. It's about what you give to ensure others can thrive. That the greatest debt we carry isn't to the past, but to the future." Her voice wavered slightly, then steadied. "Someone once told me that kindness is not charity. It's paying forward what was given to us. And I promise, to everyone here today, that I will spend my life paying it forward." The auditorium erupted in applause. Clara was openly weeping. And James sat very still, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, perhaps ever. Purpose beyond profit. Connection beyond empire. After the ceremony, in the bustling chaos of graduates and families, James approached the Penns with a large envelope. Inside was the framed photograph, Sergeant Major Penn and Lieutenant Lawson, young and alive and bound by something that transcended time. "This belongs with you," James said, handing it to Danielle. "But I had copies made. One for my office. One for the foundation." "The foundation?" Clara asked. "The Sergeant Major Penn Foundation. It launches next month." James looked at Clara steadily. "We'll provide support for veterans' families facing medical crises, medication costs, emergency care, educational scholarships. Everything your father would have wanted to protect." He paused. "And I'd like you to serve as its director, Mrs. Penn. If you're willing." Clara's hand went to her mouth, tears spilling over again, but this time she was smiling. "Ah, yes. Yes, of course." 3 months later, James stood in his driveway in the early morning light, watching as George loaded the last of Danielle's boxes into the car that would take her to Howard University. She wore a Howard sweatshirt and carried the framed photograph carefully in her arms. "Thank you," she said simply, and the weight of everything unsaid hung between them. Gratitude too large for words, a life reclaimed, a future restored. "Your grandfather saved my father," James replied quietly. "You and your mother gave me something to fight for besides another zero in a bank account." He smiled, and it felt natural, easy in a way nothing had felt in years. "I think we're even." She hugged him, quick and fierce, then climbed into the car. James stood there long after they'd driven away, watching the empty driveway, feeling something strange and unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not the restless anxiety that had plagued him for years. Not the gnawing insomnia that had driven him into his kitchen at 2 a.m. that night. Peace. The debt to the past had been paid to the future. The pattern was complete. The promise was kept. And that night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, James Lawson climbed into bed, closed his eyes, and slept.